Alright, so I'm going to respond to this comment from Kevin, who said, would it help to intellectually convince oneself that there is no such thing as I, the personal sense that we feel most of the time? So, it doesn't matter. Because that's when we're, referring to a belief or an experience or a concept, we're referring to that on the assumption that this function, this subject-object function, is real or has real value or implication when it comes to awakening, by its own terms. But what we're talking about here with no self and awakening is too complete to be governed by the terms and the rules of thought and belief or concept. It's like way outside that, but it doesn't exclude it. So there's just thought. There's only thought. It's this felt realness of the one here who owns the thought, who's relating to the thought, that creates the identification, that creates the sense of self, sense of separate self. The felt realness, which is propped up by a kind of importance or a belief in the importance or assumed importance of thought, of what the thoughts are talking about. That's why I make the distinction between the content of thought and the direct experience of thought, which is a very difficult thing to get at a certain stage of this, until there's a kind of shift out of the conceptual limitations, that kind of subjective position that conceptually relates to things through thought and really feels like the thoughts are real. The felt experience is that these thoughts are real and they refer to something real, and they are valuable, they have meaning. And just screen a bit. They're valuable, they have meaning, and they have like a kind of implication or have some sort of leverage over awakening, which they don't. So the illusion, so to speak, is, it's hard to say what it is because I don't know what it is, but I can point to the function that happens that makes it seem like the subject that relates to thought. I can point to that function that seems to create that momentum that leads to the sense of self, and it's a subjective me, a subjective thinker relating to an objective thought experience, and it's always a thought experience. So like, for example, if I relate to that bush over there in thought, I'm relating to a thought. The thought refers to an aspect of the visual experience, sense experience, that the thought labels a bush, and the subject thinks it knows what that is and thinks it has a complete understanding of what that is, but it's only relating to thought. It's not relating to the direct experience. The thought can only relate to other thoughts, or a reflected representation of what it thinks or let's say what the subject seems to think the sense experience is, and its value and its meaning. It doesn't have a clue about the actual what's there. That's unknowable. What's there is unknowable. It doesn't have a clue about the actual thought experience. It doesn't know the thought experience because it is a thought. So like the thought can't get outside of itself to refer to itself in a direct way. So that if that sounds complicated, I'll simplify it and say it's just thought. All there is thought. In the thought, it's only thought. So this sense of the subject, so it's so simple that way, because then when it's just thought, and we see that we don't have control over thoughts just appear on their own, then we don't need to resist them. We don't need to relate to our thought experience as a thinker, as a subject, and say, I can't stop thinking that's bad, or I have this thought is bad. It's the reaction to the thought, which itself is another thought, that generates that momentum in mind that props up the sense of self. When that subject, object, and mind function loses its reality, then there's no need for the continual stream of thought, the continual bouncing around of thought in the mind, to continually exert effort to prop up the reality, the felt reality of something that isn't real. Because you'll find no self in there. All you'll find is thought. So the sense of the subject also, what it seems to do is it seems to maintain the suggestion of a subjective position that's always here, that's watching thought go by, that's relating to thought after thought after thought in a kind of narrative linear stream. But that's not actually happening. When we look closely at the thought, when we really look closely at the thought, there aren't even distinct thoughts. There's not even a distinction between thought and no thought. There has to be a thought to separate that out and label it as being thought, no thought, this thought or that thought. It's actually so simple. It's so simple that thought function can't even see it, because it's happening past the simplicity. It's too simple. This is why it's consistently missed, and this is why there's this conceptual fixation that can't see past itself until it stops happening. So there has to be the suggestion of time. There has to be the suggestion of distinct, separate thoughts appearing in a sequence across that timeline. And there has to be the suggestion of something here called me separate, observing a thought experience that's happening to me, somehow separate from me. None of that's actually happening. There's just thought. And, in my earlier videos I described layers of thought, like levels of thought, and it's almost like there's no, it's almost like, of course take this with a pinch of salt, but it's almost like the access to those deeper, more fundamental functions in thought aren't really accessible when the attention and the importance is continually on conceptual thought, continually directed at thought as an object that's important. It's just not important. So that's like one of the tricky parts of this, and that I always try and emphasize, and you know, at some point, you know, some of you who are listening will just get this, and it'll be like, okay, now I get it. And I don't know why or how that happens, but that this isn't a thing. This awakening there's nothing to it. It's not a thing. It's not like what the mind makes it up to be as something like this. It's just not a thing. It's not an object. It's not an experience. It's not an attainment. It's way more simple than that, way more fundamentally, inherently already here than that, way more just the way it is. But when making a thing of it, we make an object thought interpretation of what we think awakening is from this subjective position, and then we chase it, and then in doing so we continually reinforce this subjective position, you know, and that can go on for a long time. You know, you could even have like a spiritual practice that you engage in, and that practice can get co-opted and can only be there to maintain this function, the reality of this function. But it's just used spirituality to disguise itself. I'm making it sound like a thing, but to disguise itself so that you're not going to look in the most obvious place. It's like right in front of your face. It's super obvious. But it's not obvious from that subjective position as a thing, as a something. So to answer the question, it doesn't matter. What matters is not the belief, but what I feel like I am that's holding that belief. What is it that's here that feels like that belief's important? Or to answer that question is important and means something, and is going to have some sort of implications in this as a story, as a narrative. It's much more simple than that. And the thoughts don't really calm down whilst they're still important. When they're not important, then they can calm down, because the one who's holding that position of them being important and relating to it loses its reality. So then there's just thought, like there's a bush over there. It's just a bush. It's interesting, but you know, it's not important. It doesn't matter. And when that distraction's not there, then you start to notice what is here, what is actually here. When the content of thought isn't continually suggesting its reality and absorbing all the attention, then you start to notice what's here. And that, like that, the deeper stages of this are also like just actually looking at what's here. That's it. That's like the whole thing. It's so simple. Just you could say paying attention, not being distracted all the time. What happens quite naturally is that we notice the non-dual nature of experience. It reveals itself where it is to itself inherently as the way it always is, which isn't a particular way. Anyway, I'm going to have to go now, but good questions, and I'll talk to you next time.